When we think about design and illustration in the Final Fantasy series, several names spring to mind: Tetsuya Nomura, Yoshitaka Amano, Akihiko Yoshida, perhaps even Roberto Ferrari. Yet less talked about is the career and contributions of Square Enix alumni Kazuko Shibuya, who was an early doors team member of the fledgling Squaresoft studio, helping Hironobu Sakaguchi realise his vision for what would become Final Fantasy. So who is Kazuko Shibuya? What was the trajectory of her career as a pioneering woman in games, and how did she shape the formative years of Final Fantasy over the course of the 1990s? Jumping right in, as a self-described avid illustrator in her youth, Shibuya, like many young artists, sought a career that would pay creativity, initially steering her skill set towards animation and video in the mid-1980s. Shibuya soon found that the onerous part-time work of a junior animator mass-producing tweening frames for anime was less interesting than she expected. Voicing her dissatisfaction to her art teacher, he suggested the burgeoning video games industry might be an alternative, and in 1986, Shibuya was hired at the newly minted Squaresoft just as they were transitioning away from making PC games and moving into the console market, where they would make their name. As described in previous Square staff bios, the early years at Square were nondescript, jack-of-all-trades sort of endeavours, and Shibuya found herself working on instruction manuals and using her artistic eye to assist on early Square titles, such as 1987's pioneering Rad Racer. And it was here that rudimentary technology met innovation, and between herself and revered engineers like Nasir Gebelli, they hashed out the design for Rad Racer's racetracks and colour palettes that gave it a profound sense of depth despite being a product of the 8-bit era, and resulted in a remarkably popular game from Square that just about preceded the debut of their groundbreaking Final Fantasy series. Immediately after working on Rad Racer, Shibuya shifted focus to work on the first Final Fantasy game, which would release in December 1987, and as one of the two graphic designers in the company, she worked closely with the likes of designer Koichi Ichi, Hironobu Sakaguchi, and she was the office's main point of contact for concept artist Yoshitaka Amano, whose monster designs and concept art she would work back and forth with him on, rendering and reducing them down to 8-bit pixel art for the final game. Shibuya's role across the first three Final Fantasy games was primarily designing the pixel art of characters, designing monsters, special effects and magic attacks, and the battle scene backgrounds. She was hired in part because of her prior experience in the animation industry, and as such, Shibuya contributed iconic cinematic scenes too, such as Final Fantasy I's landscape title role, which was an exercise in not just artistic ability, but working innovatively and economically within the confines of the 8-bit era. And for example, many of her stories from the time discuss how she had to work hard to reuse pixel colours, reuse assets, to create a scene with minimal memory, as much as her job was about translating high-fidelity artwork such as Yoshitaka Amano's into the iconic monsters and pixel versions for the final game. Moving through the series, Shibuya was a mainstay on Final Fantasy until Final Fantasy VI, and worked on character graphics across other notable Square titles, such as Romancing Saga. During this period, we have some of Shibuya's most enduring and recognisable non-pixel work emerge, which was the Nitashin, or chibi-style character art that was used for the packaging and promotion on Final Fantasy IV. And these were highly well-received renditions of the in-game characters that were carried over to promoting the games, and this was also the case for Final Fantasy V and Final Fantasy VI. And what we essentially have here is Shibuya's tidied up renders from her sketchbook that are side profile references of main characters and heroes from the game, probably intended as frames for an in-game pixel grid that have been coloured and stylised to a high fidelity for use on printed promotional material. And these pictures, I think, really helped distinguish Shibuya's particular style and contribution to early mid-era Final Fantasy games. And for example, the style is worlds away from the fine art of Yoshitaka Amano or the eclectic anime-leaning style of Tetsuya Nomura, and rather they sit in a very sound, functional, graphic design sort of format where we can see both the aesthetic appeal but also the practical application of how Shibuya's art is intended to work, how it relates to a pixel grid or an in-game world for the time. And to this end, we can really see how Shibuya was artistically and literally the interface between concept artists like Yoshitaka Amano and development teams such as Nasir Gebelli, filtering the creative vision down through the vector of pragmatic design that is so essential to the game design process, and particularly so in the comparatively limited era of the 8-bit and the 16-bit generation consoles. And indeed, Shibuya has stated herself in interviews over the years that her role, particularly in the early years at Square, was as much about being a communicator between teams as it was actually designing and illustrating the characters. Shifting into the 3D era, Shibuya likewise upskilled into 3D modelling software, and despite being most famous for the aforementioned pixel artwork she did on the first 6 games, she contributed to 3D renderings on the Saga titles, and later on Hironobu Sakaguchi's last Final Fantasy outing, Final Fantasy IX, where she did renders for many of the NPC characters in that game. Alongside this, and in keeping with being a jack of all trades in the art department, Shibuya worked on UI design, font designs, and menu designs for other Final Fantasy titles such as Crystal Chronicles. So a very storied, understated and interesting career trajectory that Kazuko Shibuya has had. And I think it's prudent to note, perhaps above all else, that despite being a Square employee for over 30 years, Shibuya herself does not play video games. And it's worthy to note because it counters this idea or impression of a given industry being comprised of fans rather than specialists. And the strength of Shibuya's work on games, the unique approach and innovations that she has contributed, is not necessarily the result of being beholden to or being a fan of a given genre or medium, and quite to the contrary, it illustrates the benefits of drawing broadly from different disciplines when constructing product teams, and it shows how different individuals with different approaches ensures that you're not slipping into uniformity and an aping of similar styles from within the industry itself. In recent years, Shibuya has overseen the Final Fantasy Pixel Remasters as an art director, and in this capacity she has revisited and overseen the upgrading of her original work on the first 6 games of the series, showcasing some of her iconic graphics work in higher fidelity, whether it's Final Fantasy V's Gilgamesh all the way through to legendary Final Fantasy VI characters like Kefka. In addition to this, and as a companion to the Pixel Remasters, Square published a book called FF Dot a few years ago, which very much epitomises and showcases the wonderful pixel work, largely done by Kazuko Shibuya, that was done during this first decade of her career, and I think remains testament to her legacy and her prolific output for the early Final Fantasy games. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the episode, please consider joining me on Patreon, or if you'd like to buy me a coffee, you can do so, the links are available below.